Hello there, psychology students, and welcome to another video lecture. I am Professor Zeeb. We've been learning about classical conditioning, one of the most famous models of learning of all time. And now what I'm going to teach you is we're going to expand beyond some of those basic principles, and we're going to look at some additional phenomena associated with classical conditioning. So in other words, we're going to sort of take it to the next level, if you would. All right, so let's go to our slides here. Okay, so we're going to open up this section here and look at the phenomena of classical conditioning. And there's quite a few that we're going to talk about here. All right, so the first one we're going to look at is something called acquisition. Acquisition, related to the actual word acquire, is sort of referring to how the person or animal subject acquired the response. In other words, it's referring to the original conditioning process that establishes or strengthens the conditioned response, or the CR, as we said before, okay? In other words, what we're looking at here is that acquisition is how that animal has learned to associate the two stimuli. So in other words, theoretically what this is, it's the pairing of the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus to produce that response. In other words, if that had never happened, the person or animal would never have learned how to do that. So with Pavlov and the example of him blowing a whistle or playing a bell, for example, and showing the dog food, if that had never happened, if those had never been paired together, then of course the response would never have been acquired. So basically, it is the pairing of the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus that allows this to happen. In other words, pairing the bell with the food, which led to the dog salivating, as we said before. Well, we've discovered that just as responses can be learned, they can also be somewhat unlearned, if you will, which leads us to our next point here, which is called extinction. Technically, extinction is the weakening, if you think of the word extinct, which would help you with this one, it's the weakening of the established connection between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Remember, after training, the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus and thus almost represents the unconditioned stimulus, or creates a connection between those two things, is what I mean by that. So this is sort of misleading. What this basically means is that over time, through certain strategies, we can get the conditioned response to fade or even weaken or become extinguished, if you will, okay? So the easiest way to explain this, the easiest way to extinguish a response is to repeatedly present the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus. So let's kind of go back to this previous slide to kind of explain what I mean by this. Let's just look at this simple kind of diagram of Pavlov here. Let's just briefly go through it. So food creates the response, the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. If we pair a whistle, the neutral stimulus with the food, and then over time, we said that, that the conditioned stimulus now produces the conditioned response. Because the whistle is being paired before food, eventually the dog reacts to the whistle, the sound of the whistle, as if it is food. So that whistle now is a conditioned stimulus. So once that response has been learned, what we're saying here is that over time, we can weaken or extinguish the response. So the easiest way to do this is basically to keep blowing the whistle periodically, but not pair it with food. So of course, initially the dog would still react to the whistle, the conditioned stimulus, as if it was, still in play, that it's reminding him of the food. But if we blast that whistle several times in a row, over a period of time, and we don't present food with it anymore, the dog will sort of lose interest in that. In other words, the whistle no longer means that food is in the picture, it's not being paired, and thus we would see that response fade, or as we say in psychology, extinguish. So we would extinguish that, once again, by repeatedly presenting the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus, because those aren't paired together anymore. It sort of loses its meaning and it sort of becomes something different. So we actually use this in therapy if we see that certain responses of clients, destructive responses, for example, have been learned through classical conditioning, we may attempt to extinguish it using similar type procedures, if you will. All right, let's move on. So we've talked about extinction. Let's go on to our next one, which is called spontaneous recovery, okay? Spontaneous recovery is the temporary return of the conditioned response following a delay after extinction, okay? So just as we said that responses can be extinguished and they can fade over time and weaken, there's always a chance that that behavior, that response could reemerge sort of spontaneously in the future. So let me explain. Let's use that previous example once again, where we're blowing a whistle, we're showing the dog food in order to get them to salivate. And we said over time, okay, through several pairings, the whistle has become a conditioned stimulus, which causes the conditioned response of salivating. So that has been established. Let's say that we now extinguish the response. And we said we do that by repeatedly presenting the conditioned stimulus. So we blow the whistle, no food. Blow the whistle, no food for several times over a period of time. Eventually the dog stops reacting to the whistle. They stop salivating, so the conditioned response seems like it has faded or has been extinguished. There is then a delay of time. And once again, how long that is kind of depends on several variables, okay, including how related the stimuli are, how strongly that response was learned, including other factors. But let's say that there's been a significant amount of time, a month or two, where the dog has not been exposed to the whistle, but the response has been extinguished previously. Then out of the blue, we blow the whistle and all of a sudden the dog starts salivating again. So we would say at that point, spontaneous recovery has now occurred. That dog is now reacting to the whistle, the conditioned stimulus, as if it is still there, you know, as before when it learned that, and it's still being paired with food in some way. In other words, the dog is anticipating the food. So it shows that with classical conditioning, there's a lot of power to this model that even if we extinguish certain responses, they have the potential of reoccurring down the road as this sort of concept demonstrates, okay? So let's move on to our next one. Next, we go to something called stimulus generalization. This is an occurrence of the conditioned response in reaction to stimuli that resemble the conditioned stimulus, okay? In other words, what we're finding is that the subject is not only reacting to the conditioned stimulus, which it was trained on, obviously, but may also react in the same way to other stimuli that resemble the conditioned stimulus in some way. So in other words, they're generalizing the response to other stimuli that resemble the original conditioned stimulus. Let me explain, okay? So for this one, guys, we're gonna go to the dark side of psychology, if you will. It's a really fascinating case study, but at the same time, extremely unethical by today's standards. Now you have to realize that the study that we're going to talk about was conducted a long time ago. I believe it was during the 1920s. And the ethical guidelines were very relaxed at that time. And so they could get away with different things compared to what we can do today in experiments. Okay, so we go to the very famous example of little Albert. Okay, so let me kind of give you the background here. Little Albert was this infant boy, approximately 11 months or so, and started off earlier. And he was a subject of the famous John B. Watson, considered to be the founder of American behaviorism. Watson was doing some experiments with classical conditioning and wanted to demonstrate learning responses in videos and demonstrations. So he chose this young boy to participate in the study, okay? And so at the beginning of the study, they wanted to demonstrate that he did not show fear of animals. So they would bring in different animals of various kinds, including a snake, a dog, a rabbit, a rat. And being a young, curious boy, of course, little Albert was very interested in those animals, but certainly showed no response of fear. So it was established that he was not scared of these animals. There was no reaction. Then they chose a white rat specifically, and they would bring out the white rat in front of little Albert here to kind of demonstrate that. And at the same time, Watson or one of his associates would sort of sneak up behind him with this long iron bar and a hammer. And so every time they presented the rat to this poor child, they would make a loud crashing sound by clanging those two together, which of course would frighten little Albert, and he would start crying hysterically, okay? Now keep in mind, guys, I just want to mention, please never, ever do this with a child, because obviously this could be considered to be a form of child abuse, and obviously could scar that child and create some pretty hardcore effects of that. So I just want to say that, you know, disclaimer, never ever do this with a child. So Watson repeatedly did this over a period of weeks, I believe it was. So every time they showed the rat, the white rat, he would make these loud, startling noise behind the infant, and he would cry. So you can imagine after doing this, say maybe 10, 20 times or whatever, that when they would bring the rat out after going through that, he would immediately start crying. So in other words, in a sense, they manufactured a phobia of white rats in this poor child by doing that. So the point is that the rat now becomes a conditioned stimulus, which produces the conditioned response of fear because it was being paired with the loud noise, the unconditioned stimulus. What they noticed, something kind of interesting, and back to the point here, is that little Albert not only reacted to the white rat with fear, but they noticed that he reacted to almost every furry item, including a rabbit, which he was never trained on. And famously, Watson showed him a Santa Claus mask with the big white furry beard. He would immediately start crying at the sight of the furry beard. So you guys see what's happening here? He is generalizing his response of fear to all furry things, and in some cases, white furry things, which resembles the rat. So in other words, that response has now branched to other stimuli and not just the original conditioned stimulus of the white rat. So that's what we mean by stimulus generalization, is sometimes the subject will react in the same way to other similar type stimuli, even though they were never technically trained on them. Okay, so hopefully that made it a little bit clearer. Like I said, a tragic, very unethical example in psychology, and just amazing, just very intriguing and interesting case study, but at the same time, you feel for that little infant who was basically traumatized by that experience, obviously. Okay, the last one I want to talk about is something called discrimination. In a sense, it's kind of like the counterpart of generalization. So discrimination is where the subject responds differently to two similar stimuli. However, they predict different outcomes. In other words, these two stimuli may be exactly alike in some way. However, one leads to something and the other does not, and thus the person can learn to tell the difference between them or discriminate among stimuli based on that experience. Okay, so I'm going to, for this one, I'm going to go to a study. Let's go to our next slide here. So in this study, subjects were asked to smell different chemicals or odors, if you would. Okay, and by the way, this study was conducted by Lai, Howard, Parrish, and Gottfried in 2008. Okay, so it comes from that study. And they presented these subjects with two different chemicals. Let's get our pointer out here so I can kind of demonstrate a little bit. So we'll call the first chemical, chemical 1, and then chemical 2. So these are two different chemicals or odors, if you would. But it's important to point out that they smell completely identical. So they actually have the exact same odor, but technically they are different chemicals, okay? So at the beginning of the experiment, the subjects could not tell the difference between those two chemicals because they smell identical. They could literally not tell the difference between chemical 1 and chemical 2, okay? So as the study progressed, every time, and keep in mind these were randomly mixed up, but every time the subject smelled or sniffed chemical 1, they would follow that by an electric shock. So in other words, that was being paired with a little jolt immediately after, where the second chemical, whenever the subject sniffed this particular odor or chemical, they were not given a shock. So I'm just going to kind of cross it out here. In other words, nothing happened. Now remember, at the beginning of the experiment, the subjects could not tell the difference between those two odors because they smelled identical. But through the progression of the study, odor 1 followed by a shock, odor 2 was not. After going through that experience, they found that over time, through classical conditioning, you could argue, the subjects were able to tell the difference between odor 1 and odor 2 because of the experience that followed them, or the different outcome. In this case, it was a shock, and in this case, there was none. In other words, when the subjects would smell chemical 1, it's kind of like they were anticipating being shocked. So through classical conditioning, the pairing of those stimuli, it allowed them to basically tell the difference where before they could not. So that's what we call discrimination. The subjects were able to discriminate among stimuli because this one led to this unpleasant outcome and this one did not. Okay, so that's what we mean by discrimination. All right, so thank you for listening. That'll conclude the short little lecture here. So I want you to progress to the next step in the class. I hope you're enjoying it, and we will see you online.